9 years after a young girl and her uncle vanished during a lakeside picnic, a kayaker's GoPro footage captures a submerged backpack and doll, triggering a cold case investigation that unearths buried secrets, a hidden body, and the chilling possibility that the girl may still be alive. The air smelled like sunscreen and honeysuckle that afternoon, the kind of summer day people remember for years. Lake Wren shimmered under a clear Michigan sky as families dotted the grassy shoreline, their laughter mingling with the soft lap of water. Joanna Calhoun spread a blanket beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree, glancing over her shoulder to where her daughter Lena and her brother-in-law Ben were skipping stones along the bank. Lena's giggles echoed across the lake. She had just turned 9 and was inseparable from Ben, who had stepped into a fatherly role after Joanna's husband passed away 2 years earlier. Ben was easy to love. Tall, with a lopsided grin and a calm that made kids feel safe, he had a way of making even the smallest moment feel like an adventure. That day he'd promised Lena a secret trail he'd discovered along the edge of the lake. "Just a short walk," he said, grabbing a granola bar and 2 bottles of water before they disappeared into the trees. Joanna didn't worry at first. They'd gone off on walks before. Ben always brought her back smiling and sun-kissed. But an hour passed. Then 2. When the sun began its slow descent behind the trees, and there was still no sign of them, worry began to bloom into something colder, sharper. By nightfall, park rangers had been alerted. Flashlights cut through the woods, calling Lena's name. Boats combed the shallows with spotlights. Ben's car was still parked where he had left it. No signs of a struggle. No screams had been heard, no evidence found, save for one red sneaker bobbing against a piece of driftwood near the northern inlet 2 days later. Despite an extensive search that spanned weeks, the case stalled. Authorities ruled it a probable drowning, though currents that strong had never been recorded in Lake Wren. Joanna refused to accept it. Years passed, seasons shifted. People moved on. But 9 years later, in the stillness of early spring, a man in a red kayak drifted into a secluded cove on Lake Wren, his GoPro mounted to the bow. He paddled slowly, unaware that the camera had just captured something beneath the surface, something tangled in reeds, something that would reignite everything. The kayaker's name was Thomas Bell, a retired biology teacher who had taken up wildlife photography as a way to fill the quiet hours of early spring. He preferred the lake before summer crowds arrived, when the waters were still and the tree-lined banks were hushed like the world was holding its breath. His GoPro, mounted at the front of his kayak, ran continuously during each paddle, capturing herons lifting off in silence, turtles sunning on rocks, and the occasional glint of trout darting beneath the surface. That morning was no different. He set out just after sunrise, gliding across the glassy water with only the rhythmic dip of his paddle breaking the stillness. The air was crisp and clean, scented faintly with pine. He followed the shoreline lazily, stopping here and there to film the nesting loons near the far end of the lake. As he rounded the tip of a narrow peninsula, he entered a secluded cove shaded by overgrown trees that leaned over the water like spectators. It was quiet, eerily so. Thomas didn't notice the shape at first, a dull smudge beneath the surface, half caught in a mess of reeds and fallen branches near the cove's edge. He might have paddled right past it, had the sun not caught the shape of something pale and unnatural drifting just below the surface. He leaned forward and saw what looked like fabric pink, or maybe faded red, tangled around a clump of algae. He steadied the kayak and reached for his phone, snapping a few pictures before gently nudging his paddle beneath the water for a closer look. A decayed strap floated up, connected to something rectangular and half-submerged. It was a backpack. Weather-worn and bloated from years of exposure, but unmistakable. He saw a zipper barely clinging to its track and the edge of what looked like yarn hair peeking from an interior pocket. He backed away slowly. By the time he reached the ranger station on the southern shore, his hands were shaking. The officer on duty listened carefully as Thomas showed him the photos. The moment the doll appeared on screen, the ranger froze, his face going pale. "I think you just reopened a case that hasn't been touched in almost a decade," The ranger's name was Eli Novak, a soft-spoken man who had worked at Lake Wren for over 15 years. He remembered the Calhoun case clearly. Everyone did. It had haunted the town like a ghost, hanging in the corners of family cookouts and school recitals. 2 people had gone into the woods, and neither had come out. A search of unprecedented scale had yielded nothing but Lena's sneaker and questions that refused to die. Eli stared at the photo on Thomas Bell's phone for a long moment before reaching for the landline. As he spoke with the county sheriff's office, his voice was quiet but urgent. He asked Thomas to wait, stepped into a back room, and returned with a thick binder. Inside were laminated copies of incident reports, maps from the original search, and photographs. He flipped to a page and pulled out an image. It was a photo of Lena, taken just days before she vanished. In her arms was the same cloth doll, small, handmade, with crooked button eyes and yarn hair in 2 bright yellow braids. Her name was Daisy, Eli said, tapping the photo. Lena brought her everywhere, even slept with her at night. If that doll's been underwater for 9 years and survived, well, it's a miracle. But it also means something's down there with it. Within the hour, deputies arrived at the ranger station. The photo of the backpack and doll was forwarded to the state forensic team. A call was made to the county dive unit. And across town, a quiet knock came at the door of a modest home where Joanna Calhoun lived alone, the walls still lined with pictures of the daughter she had never stopped hoping to find. When she opened the door and saw the badge, her breath caught in her throat. "Mrs. Calhoun," the officer said gently, "we may have found something at Lake Wren, something connected to Lena." Joanna's hands trembled as she pulled her cardigan tight around her shoulders. She had waited 9 years for news, both dreading and longing for it. "What did you find?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The officer didn't answer right away. He just stepped aside and handed her a printed photograph. Joanna's knees nearly gave out. She hadn't seen that doll since the day her little girl disappeared. Joanna sat at her kitchen table, the photograph of the waterlogged doll resting between her trembling hands. The corners of the image curled slightly, but the contents were clear. Daisy. Still wearing the faded purple dress Joanna had stitched herself one snowy winter years ago. Her button eyes stared blankly through the plastic sleeve, water-stained but unmistakable. She hadn't spoken yet. The officer who delivered the photo stood quietly nearby, giving her space. After a long silence, Joanna finally looked up. Where exactly was this found? The officer explained that a kayaker had discovered it in a cove near the northern point of Lake Wren, an area overgrown and largely untouched during the original search. The water had shifted over time, possibly revealing something that had been hidden beneath layers of silt and weeds for nearly a decade. Joanna absorbed the words slowly, like someone waking from a long, heavy sleep. For years, she'd clung to the possibility that Lena was still out there, somewhere, maybe taken, maybe lost. She had imagined reunions, dreamed of her daughter appearing at her door older, changed but alive. But the doll was never far from those dreams. Daisy was Lena's anchor. She would never have let it go voluntarily. The officer cleared his throat gently. "We've requested a dive team to return to the site. There may be other items nearby. Personal effects, possibly more." Joanna nodded, her voice barely audible. "Has Ben's family been contacted?" "They will be. The sheriff wanted you to be the first to know." She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the familiar ache bloom deep in her chest. Ben had been more than just her brother-in-law. He was her best friend. The last piece of her husband, after he died in that boating accident 5 years before Lena vanished. Losing Ben and Lena on the same day had been like losing her entire world. Now something had returned. Not a miracle, not the child herself, but a thread. A thread pulled loose from the past, threatening to unravel everything. Joanna stood slowly, her hands steadying on the back of the kitchen chair. "Tell the sheriff," she said, her voice low but firm. "I want to be there when they pull whatever's next from that lake. The sun had barely risen when Joanna arrived at the northern edge of Lake Wren, escorted by Detective Amy Noland and a deputy from the sheriff's office. The cove was smaller than she remembered from photos and maps, its still water framed by drooping willow branches and dense reeds. A light mist clung to the lake's surface, drifting lazily like smoke from a dying fire. The dock was temporary, built hastily the day before by the dive team to provide a safe staging area. It creaked underfoot as Joanna stepped onto it, clutching the sleeves of her jacket like armor. She scanned the water, searching for anything out of place, but it was quiet, peaceful, deceptive. Detective Noland stood beside her, tall and composed, her eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. "They're going to begin the descent in a few minutes," she said softly. "The water's shallow here, but visibility is poor. We don't know how much has been preserved." Joanna nodded. Her gaze dropped to the water's edge, where Thomas Bell's kayak had first drifted past what would turn out to be the lost backpack. She pictured Lena and Ben in this very spot. Had they come here willingly? Were they lured? Or was this where something terrible began? A splash broke her thoughts. Two divers in full gear slipped beneath the surface with barely a ripple. Joanna held her breath. Minutes passed in slow, aching silence. The only sounds were the quiet lapping of water and the occasional murmur of radios. Then one of the divers surfaced and raised a gloved hand. They had something. A black mesh bag was hauled onto the dock, heavy with lake water and silt. The diver opened it carefully. Joanna stepped forward, heart pounding. Inside was what looked like a second shoe, small and faded pink with a partially detached Velcro strap. She recognized it instantly. The matching pair to the sneaker found 9 years earlier. Detective Noland crouched to examine it. "We'll need to send it for lab work, but the size and model are consistent with what Lena was wearing." Joanna's breath caught. This wasn't closure. Not yet. But it was proof. Something had happened here. And the lake, at last, was giving up its secrets. Detective Amy Noland watched the lab technicians place the waterlogged shoe into a sealed evidence container, her mind already moving faster than her pen could catch up. This wasn't just a fluke recovery. Two items surfacing 9 years later in the same secluded cove suggested intentionality. She had worked cold cases long enough to know when a scene was trying to speak. Back at the sheriff's office, she sat in the dim confines of the evidence room, poring over the original case file. The documents were brittle at the edges, creased from years of being passed between hands that never found answers. Statements, photos, terrain maps. One stuck out, a report filed 2 days after the disappearance by a camper named Gwen Liscombe, who had claimed to hear a scream near the northern trail at sunset. At the time, it had been dismissed. Animals, the rangers had said, wind through the trees. The search had been focused on the south end, where Lena's first sneaker had washed up. Noland made a note to find Gwen. 9 years was a long time, but screams weren't something people easily forgot. Meanwhile, the dive team continued their work. That afternoon, they recovered another item buried in the lakebed silt, a rusted thermos with a dented lid, the kind often clipped to a hiking bag. Inside, packed into the hollow chamber, was a tangle of damp paper. When carefully unfolded back at the lab, one fragment revealed a faint hand-drawn sketch of a girl holding hands with a tall man. At the bottom, the name Lena was written in blocky letters. It wasn't conclusive, but it felt like a whisper from the past. Joanna stared at the drawing for a long time when Noland brought it to her. She traced the outline of the figures, then silently nodded. It was Lena's. She used to draw pictures like that all the time, especially after her father died. "This changes everything," Noland said quietly. "These weren't just lost items. They were preserved, hidden, and someone didn't want them found." Joanna looked up, eyes sharp through her grief. "Then we find out who." The next morning, Detective Noland stood at the mouth of the trail that wound through the northern woods just yards from where the lake curved into the cove. The trees here grew thick and close together, branches knitted overhead like fingers holding back the sun. She stared down the path, now choked with vines and leaf debris, its earth softened by years of rot and silence. She radioed her team to begin sweeping the area. Metal detectors clicked to life. Markers were placed every few feet. A forensic archaeologist was flown in from Lansing to help sift through the saturated ground. Noland had a gut feeling. If items were turning up now, they were never meant to stay hidden forever. As the search progressed, a deputy called out. He had found something. Half buried beneath a fallen log just off the trail, they uncovered the rusted frame of a small collapsible camping chair. Nearby, partially covered by moss and soil, was a torn nylon pouch containing an old map of the park and a compass, both labeled with initials in faded Sharpie, B.W. Ben Walker. Joanna was called to confirm. She didn't need long. The compass had been a Christmas gift, one her late husband had given Ben when they were teenagers. Joanna remembered wrapping it herself. She stood silently in the field tent where the items had been laid out, staring down at the compass like it might start spinning with answers. It didn't. But it was enough to press the case forward. Later that day, Noland reviewed the original list of park visitors from 2016. Most had been interviewed at the time and cleared. But one name stood out, not for what it said, but for what it lacked. A man had signed into the campsite registry with only initials and a phone number. The number was long dead, and the initials didn't match any known campers or permit holders. He'd reserved a site near the North Cove for one night, then vanished. She circled the entry in red. Back at her desk, she stared at it a long time before picking up the phone. "I want to know everything about whoever signed in that night with the initials R.D., she said. Where he went, what he drove, and why no one looked harder. Detective Noland waited while the records clerk pulled the old visitor logs from the county archives. The scanned copy she had seen earlier confirmed the initials, but she wanted the physical book in her hands. When the binder landed on the counter, she flipped directly to the page marked with the date of the disappearance. There it was. Neat, almost too neat, a single line near the bottom of the page. R.D., Campsite 14, one night, phone number now disconnected. No address, no full name, no handwriting match on file. She studied the way the R slanted slightly to the left, the D curved with excessive care. It didn't look like someone in a rush. It looked like someone deliberately holding back. Back at the station, she dug through archived police interviews. Most visitors that weekend had been day hikers or families. One had even filmed portions of their trip and turned over the footage during the investigation. But no one had mentioned a man camping alone near the North Cove, and there was no record of the officers ever following up on Campsite 14. She frowned. In 2016, the working theory had been drowning. No evidence of a crime, no signs of foul play. Search dogs had tracked to the water's edge and stopped. That had satisfied the conclusion. No one had asked why the scent ended so abruptly, or why Lena's sneaker turned up in a location that didn't fit the wind or current patterns. Noland picked up the phone and called the state database unit. "I need help identifying someone who used the initials R.D. on a campsite registry at Lake Wren in June of 2016. I also need a cross-check of any past permits, citations, or reported incidents under those initials. Try Ray, Ronald, Richard, Robert, anything that fits." She hung up and stared at the map pinned to her wall. Red markers indicated the search zones from 9 years ago. The North Cove hadn't even been covered until day 6. Too little, too late. Whatever had happened back then had slipped through cracks no one wanted to admit were there. But not this time. Noland leaned back in her chair, watching the rain begin to tap gently against the window. She could feel it now. Whoever R.D. was, he had been close that day. Too close. The rain continued through the night, turning the dirt trails around Lake Wren into slick ribbons of mud. By morning, the search teams had called off field activity until conditions improved, leaving the cove quiet again. Detective Noland spent the morning at her desk, thumbing through personnel rosters from the original investigation. She wasn't looking for what was there. She was looking for what wasn't. At 10:13 a.m., her phone buzzed. "This is Noland. We have a hit," said the analyst on the other end. Initials RD matched to a Ray Doyle, born 1975. Minor infractions in his 20s. Trespassing, loitering, a disorderly conduct charge that was pled down. Nothing since. But he did register for a campsite at Lake Wren that exact weekend under those same initials. Noland sat up straighter. Where is he now? He moved out of state a few months after the Calhoun case. No forwarding address, but he had mail going to a P.O. box in Traverse City for about a year. DMV records show a forwarding license issued in 2017 to an address in Ontario, Canada. We're working on confirmation now. She wrote down the name slowly. Ray Doyle. There was something about it that prickled the back of her mind. She ended the call and turned to her whiteboard, where the known facts were laid out in careful columns. Lena's drawing, the compass, the recovered shoe, all scattered like breadcrumbs in a story no one finished reading. Pulling up the archived list of 2016 interviews, she searched for any mention of the name Doyle. Nothing. He had never been questioned. Outside, the rain began to let up. Thin beams of light pierced the clouds and painted the office walls a soft silver. Noland rose and walked to the window, watching a pair of birds flit between the pine branches beyond the parking lot. If Ray Doyle had been at Lake Wren that day and left without ever speaking to police, it wasn't because he had nothing to say. It was because he didn't want to be found. And now, 9 years later, he had no idea someone was finally looking. Joanna sat alone in her living room, the soft hum of the dishwasher the only sound in the house. The photograph of the recovered doll lay on the coffee table, framed now, as if honoring not just Lena, but the fragile thread of memory that still bound them together. She had stared at it so long the image seemed burned into the air itself. The phone rang, jarring her from her thoughts. "Mrs. Calhoun," came Detective Noland's voice, calm but deliberate. "We've identified someone who was at Lake Wren the day Lena and Ben disappeared. A man who signed in with initials only. He was never interviewed." Joanna felt her chest tighten. "Do you think he's involved?" Noland paused. "It's too soon to say, but it's a lead worth following. His name is Ray Doyle. We're working to locate him now. He left the country shortly after the investigation began. Moved to Canada under a different address." Joanna's grip on the phone tightened. "Do you think Lena was taken?" Noland hesitated, but her answer came steady. "There's evidence that contradicts the drowning theory. Someone may have deliberately hidden those items in the cove, and there are signs of staging. Things positioned to mislead." Joanna closed her eyes. A memory surfaced. Lena laughing as Ben lifted her onto his shoulders, the way her daughter had waved at the lake like it could wave back. It had seemed impossible then that a place so beautiful could hide something so dark. "Whatever you find," she said softly, "I need to know, even if it hurts, even if it confirms the worst." "You'll be the first to know," Noland promised. After the call ended, Joanna sat motionless for a long time. Then she stood and crossed the room to the hallway where Lena's drawings were still pinned to a corkboard, untouched since 2016. Rainbows. Stick figures, a family standing beside a lake. One had the words written in crayon along the bottom, "I love my Uncle Ben." She touched the page with the back of her hand, gently, as if the paper might break. A part of her had accepted long ago that Lena was gone, but now, for the first time in years, another part began to stir. The smallest, most fragile part. Hope. The sky had cleared over Lake Wren, and sunlight streamed through the trees in broken shafts, dappling the muddy trail below. Detective Noland walked slowly along the path Lena and Ben had likely taken that afternoon 9 years ago. It was narrower than expected, nearly swallowed by time and undergrowth, but it was still here. Faint footprints in the soft soil from the dive team marked the way forward. She stopped at a bend where the lake peeked through the trees. From this spot, the cove wasn't visible, but it was nearby, a quiet, hidden place. Too quiet. Back at the station, she'd begun reconstructing the timeline of the disappearance, hour by hour. Lena and Ben had left the family picnic around 2:45 p.m., according to statements. Witnesses remembered Ben saying he wanted to show Lena a turtle nest he'd found near the edge of the woods. He took 2 water bottles, a granola bar, and his phone. The phone had never been recovered. At 3:30, Joanna had begun looking for them. By 4:00, mild concern. By 5:00, panic. She reported them missing to park officials just before sunset. The first search crews arrived after dark. Noland reviewed surveillance from the ranger station, now digitized. There were no cameras in the woods or near the northern trail back then, but the station did capture vehicles entering and leaving. No unusual traffic, no signs of anyone leaving in a hurry. Except for one detail. A red pickup truck parked near the north trailhead on the day of the disappearance had never been accounted for. It showed up at 10:12 a.m. and left just after 6 p.m., the same hour the park began to shut down the main gates. No license plate was clearly visible. No matching vehicle was ever linked to any of the registered campers. She froze the footage on the screen. The truck was older, early 90s, with rust along the bumper and a distinct dent above the rear wheel. It wasn't conclusive, but it was something. She snapped a still frame and printed it. Someone had parked right by that trail, someone who never came forward, and if that truck belonged to Ray Doyle, then this wasn't just a case of vanishing, it was a case of being taken. The following morning, Detective Noland stood at the evidence board, her eyes scanning the timeline she had rebuilt piece by piece. She had added the photograph of the red pickup truck, the blurry still from the ranger station camera, and underneath it, a name written in thick black marker, Ray Doyle. She didn't believe in coincidences, not when it came to missing children. The original investigators had chalked up the case to a tragic accident. They had followed protocol, searched the woods, combed the lake, filed statements, but looking through their notes now, Noland could see how easily assumptions had crept in. The moment Lena's sneaker had been found in the water, the theory of drowning had taken root, and everything that didn't support it had quietly fallen away. Like the camper who had heard a scream. Noland tracked down Gwen Liscombe that afternoon. Now in her 50s, Gwen lived in a modest home in the next county over, her front porch strung with wind chimes and drying herbs. She remembered that weekend at the lake clearly. The weather, the noise, the silence. She invited Noland in and pulled out a notebook she had kept from her solo camping trips, filled with dated observations and sketches. She flipped to the page marked June 12, 2016. At the bottom of the page, written in capital letters, was a single line, "Heard a scream around dusk. Not an animal, too human." "I told the ranger," Gwen said quietly. "I even showed him this, but he said the dogs had already tracked to the water, that it must have been a fox or something. But I know what I heard." Noland nodded slowly, taking a photo of the page. Every detail Gwen had provided lined up with the estimated window of the disappearance. But no one had followed up with her. No one had even noted her report in the official file. When Noland returned to her vehicle, she sat in silence for a moment, her thoughts loud in the quiet car. If someone had heard a scream, and someone else had left the park that evening without ever being questioned, it meant only one thing. Lena hadn't vanished into the lake. Someone had taken her out of it. Joanna found herself standing in Lena's old bedroom, the door creaking slightly as she pushed it open. Nothing had changed. The walls were still painted pale lavender, the ceiling dotted with glow-in-the-dark stars. On the dresser, a framed school photo captured Lena mid-laugh, front teeth missing, eyes bright. She had been 8 then, just a few months before everything went wrong. Joanna hadn't touched the room in years. She had vacuumed and dusted, but never moved anything. Not the unicorn lamp, not the bookshelf stacked with dog-eared chapter books. Not the pillowcase Lena had insisted on bringing to every sleepover because it smelled like home. She sank down onto the edge of the bed, the mattress barely giving under her weight. In her hands, she held the sketch. Detective Noland had shown her the one pulled from the rusted thermos. The drawing of a tall man holding a girl's hand near a lake, her name printed carefully in the corner. Lena had made it. Which meant Lena had been alive after the point they all thought she was gone, alive long enough to draw, alive long enough to hope someone might find what she left behind. Joanna didn't cry. The tears had come years ago, drained her dry. What she felt now was something colder, sharper. A mother's fury masked in calm. Her phone buzzed beside her. It was Noland. "We just got confirmation from Canadian Border Services," the detective said. "Ray Doyle used his real name when applying for a vehicle registration in Ontario back in 2017. He's been off the grid since, but that's the last known address tied to him." "Are you going after him?" Joanna asked, standing now, moving to the window where sunlight filtered through the blinds and painted dust in the air. "Yes, I've notified the task force. We're preparing an extradition request. If he's connected to Lena's disappearance, we'll find out." Joanna hung up and stared at the yard beyond her window. A wind stirred the leaves. Somewhere, a dog barked. Life continued. People moved on. But she would not. She would see this through. Whatever it took. Whoever this man was, he had taken more than a child. He had taken time. And that was something no one could ever give back. The cabin sat at the edge of a faded gravel road in Ontario, surrounded by thick pine and shadow. It was modest, nearly swallowed by the trees, its roof sagging and windows clouded with grime. A mailbox, rusted half open, leaned beside the dirt drive, its flag missing, and moss crept up the porch steps like it had claimed the place years ago. Detective Noland and 2 Canadian officers approached the front door just after sunrise. The air was sharp with morning chill, and a hush hung over the forest that felt almost deliberate. Noland's heart thudded, not from fear, but from the weight of what might wait behind that door. They knocked. Nothing. Another knock, louder this time, followed by one of the officers calling out in French. Still silence. Just the wind threading through the pine. They breached the door at 7:16 a.m. The inside smelled of dust and old wood. A wood stove sat unused in the corner, a single mug on the table beside a half-folded newspaper. A cot in the back had sheets still warm, the indentation of a body recent. Someone had been here, maybe even minutes ago. They moved carefully through the small space, clearing each corner. In a back storage closet, tucked behind paint cans and a rusted fishing tackle box, they found a locked trunk. The padlock was cheap. It broke open with one twist of a crowbar. Inside were neatly arranged stacks of old magazines, most innocuous, some less so. Beneath them, wrapped in plastic and duct tape, were bundles of photographs. Noland didn't need to look at them all. Just one. It was a Polaroid. A young girl with light brown hair, sitting in a folding chair, staring directly at the camera. Her expression was blank, but her eyes, those were Lena's eyes. Older now. Maybe 10, maybe 11. A few years past her disappearance. Not a child anymore, but still a child. Noland turned to the officers. "He's been here." And he kept her for longer than anyone thought. She looked back down at the photograph, her jaw set. This wasn't just abduction. This was captivity. This was control. And Lena's story was not over yet. Joanna was at the kitchen sink when the call came through. The sun had just begun to warm the windowsill, glinting off a line of unwashed mugs. She didn't recognize the number but answered anyway, her breath catching when she heard the voice on the other end. "This is Detective Noland. We found something." Joanna pressed the phone tighter to her ear, moving instinctively to the table, lowering herself into the chair like her knees could no longer be trusted. "We believe Ray Doyle stayed in a cabin in Ontario. He wasn't there when we arrived, but we recovered items. Photos." "Hey." Her voice faltered for just a second before continuing. "Joanna, we found a picture of a girl who appears to be Lena, not from the time she disappeared, but years later. She's older. It means she survived beyond that first day." Joanna didn't speak at first. Her hand was over her mouth, her eyes wide with a disbelief so sharp it didn't feel real. She blinked once, then again, before managing a whisper. She was alive. We believe so. And now, we think she may still be. Joanna stood walking to the hallway, her fingers trailing the wall until they found the frame that held Lena's school portrait. Her little girl, frozen in time at 9 years old. She imagined her older now, taller, changed. "Does this mean he's still moving her?" she asked. "We don't know," Nolan admitted. "But there are signs he didn't stay in that cabin long. Food wrappers, warm bedding, receipts. He might be running again, but this time he left something behind." There was a silence between them, heavy and full of meaning. "When do I see the photo?" Joanna asked. "I'll bring it in person," Nolan said. "It's better that way." Joanna hung up slowly. Outside, wind stirred the branches. A squirrel darted across the lawn. She pressed her forehead to the cool glass of the window, her breath fogging the pane. Lena had lived. For how long? In what conditions? She didn't know. But one truth had cut through the darkness. Her daughter hadn't vanished. She had been stolen. And maybe, just maybe, she could still be found. Detective Nolan stepped into the conference room at the sheriff's department carrying a thin manila folder. Joanna was already there, seated at the far end of the table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked up as Nolan entered, her expression unreadable, eyes rimmed with a quiet exhaustion that came from years of waiting without answers. Without speaking, Nolan slid the folder across the table and took a seat across from her. Joanna stared at it for a moment, then reached out and opened it slowly. Inside was a single photograph, slightly curled at the corners. It had been printed from a scan of the original Polaroid recovered from the cabin. The girl in the picture was older than Lena had been when she vanished, but not by much. Her hair was shorter, tangled at the edges, and her clothes didn't match. A too large sweatshirt, sleeves hanging over her hands. Her eyes were sunken, rimmed in shadow, but they were unmistakable. Joanna pressed a hand to her mouth, tears slipping down her cheeks without sound. "She was 10 there," Nolan said quietly. "Maybe 11. It was taken a year or two after she disappeared. Forensics are still analyzing the rest of the items found in the cabin, but this is what confirms it." Joanna nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's her." Nolan let the silence stretch, giving her time. Outside the window, the early afternoon sun flickered behind moving clouds, casting long shadows across the floor. "We believe she was kept there for some time," Nolan continued. "But the cabin was recently used again. Fresh food, warm blankets, recent receipts. He's on the move. And now we know for certain who we're looking for." Joanna lifted the photo from the folder, cradling it gently between her fingers like something fragile that might tear if held too tightly. She stared into her daughter's face, not as she remembered her, but as she had become. "She looks scared," she whispered. Nolan nodded. "She probably was." Joanna didn't look up. "Then we need to find her before he disappears again." And for the first time since the call, her voice held something that wasn't sorrow. It was resolve. The forensic team worked late into the night, cataloging everything pulled from the cabin. Each item was carefully photographed, tagged, and stored. Most of it was old and unremarkable. Torn blankets, empty soup cans, a pocket knife dulled from use. But tucked behind a loose floorboard in the back room, they found something else. A second bundle of photographs. These were older, some nearly stuck together from moisture, but a few were crisp, carefully stored in a plastic sleeve. Detective Nolan examined them one by one under the harsh fluorescent light of the evidence room. Lena appeared in several, sometimes seated on the floor, sometimes beside a small camping stove. She never smiled. Her posture was tense, guarded. In one, her hands were bound in front of her, zip ties barely visible in the frame. Nolan's stomach turned. Another photo showed her asleep on a mattress, a heavy blanket pulled to her chin. There were toys in the background, newer ones, some still in packaging. He was trying to keep her there, not just hidden, kept. She placed the photos down and took a breath, then picked up the last item in the bundle, a small, lined notebook with the edges curled and stained. Inside were handwritten notes, uneven and erratic. Some pages were lists, supplies, chores. Others were filled with sentences repeated over and over. Stay quiet. Don't trust them. No one is looking. One page stood out, near the back, in smaller, more delicate handwriting, different from the rest. I don't know what day it is anymore. But if someone finds this, my name is Lena Calhoun. Please don't stop looking for me. Nolan blinked, the words sinking in like stones. It was real. All of it. This wasn't just survival. It was resistance. Lena had left a message, hidden among the scribbles of her captor. She picked up her phone and dialed. "Joanna," she said when the line clicked open. "We found a notebook," she wrote in it. Joanna's breath hitched. What did she say? Nolan hesitated just a moment. She asked us not to stop. Joanna was silent, and then her voice came, low but fierce. "Then we won't." Detective Nolan stood beside the bulletin board in the task force command room, now covered in maps, photographs, and handwritten notes. Red strings traced connections between cities, sightings, receipts. The photo of Lena, the one from the cabin, was pinned near the center. Below it, a copy of the notebook page she had written. Those simple words had relit the fire in every investigator working the case. She turned as Agent Mark Sutherland from the U.S. Marshals stepped inside. He was tall, with a gruff demeanor that rarely softened, but even he paused when he glanced at the wall. "You think he's still moving her?" he asked. Nolan nodded. "We found unopened food in the cabin, a fresh blanket. He wasn't planning on staying, but he brought someone with him. A second cot was set up, smaller." Sutherland walked to the board and tapped a recent photo. It showed a blurred figure at a roadside convenience store just over the Canadian border. The man matched Ray Doyle's build. A girl trailed behind him, partially obscured by a hoodie 2 sizes too large. "That was taken 3 days ago," he said. Facial recognition flagged him off a gas station camera in upstate New York. Nolan moved to the board and circled the town on the map. "They're heading south. We think he's avoiding major highways. He's smart, but he's predictable. Every sighting is near wooded areas, state parks, remote corners." Sutherland narrowed his eyes. "He's looking for another hiding place." Nolan nodded. "And eventually he'll stop to rest. That's when we'll move." Joanna, meanwhile, sat in a quiet room down the hall, flanked by a counselor and a family liaison officer. She had just been shown the store footage. Even blurry, even shadowed, her hand had flown to her mouth when the girl came into frame. The way she walked, the tilt of her shoulders, she recognized it all. "She's alive," Joanna whispered. "Yes," the counselor said gently. "And we're close." Joanna stared at the screen long after it went black. She wasn't imagining it this time. It wasn't a dream. Her daughter had made it through 9 years of silence, and she was still out there, waiting. The air was thick with heat as the unmarked vehicles crept down the gravel road that bordered a dense patch of state forest in southern Pennsylvania. Dust rose in low clouds behind them, curling in the sunlight like breath. Detective Nolan sat in the passenger seat, her eyes locked on the GPS tracker in her lap. The latest tip had come just hours earlier. A hiker reported seeing a man and a girl walking along the edge of the woods near a trailhead, the girl holding a plastic bag and looking over her shoulder like she expected to be followed. The description matched Ray Doyle and the girl in the store footage. And it was the first tip in days that felt grounded in truth. The convoy stopped a half-mile from the trail entrance. The rest would be done on foot. Nolan pulled her vest into place and stepped into the oppressive afternoon heat. Birds chirped overhead. The hum of insects buzzed in the underbrush. Somewhere out here, Lena might be waiting. She tried not to let the weight of that thought slow her pace. The search party moved in a wide arc, combing the edge of the woods near an abandoned fire lookout marked on a decades-old Forest Service map. A ranger had mentioned it earlier, just a concrete foundation and a rusted water tank now, but still occasionally used by squatters or off-grid travelers. It was the kind of place someone might stop for a night without leaving a trace. Then a voice crackled through the radio. "Got a structure. Smoke's rising. Looks recent." Nolan's heart kicked against her ribs as she picked up her pace, weaving through tangled brush and ducking beneath low branches. When the trees opened up, she saw it, a weather-beaten canvas tent pitched beside a ring of blackened stones. A small campfire smoldered. No sound, no movement. But there were 2 plates, one half full, one cleared. She crouched beside the fire and spotted it 2 small shoe prints pressed into the soft dirt, one angled outward just slightly. Her breath caught. A child had stood here. Recently. She stood and turned to the others. "They're close," she said. "He's still with her." And the chase, at last, had narrowed to one final stretch. The search party fanned out carefully, boots pressing into the soft forest floor, eyes scanning every shadow and break in the underbrush. The campfire was still warm, the ashes shifting with the breeze, and the tin mug left beside the tent held water that hadn't yet cooled. Detective Nolan crouched again to study the footprints. They led east, weaving through tall ferns and narrow gaps between trees. They weren't more than an hour behind. She signaled to Agent Sutherland, who nodded and relayed orders to the perimeter team. No lights, no sirens, no mistakes. If Doyle sensed pursuit, he might vanish again and take the girl with him. Nolan followed the prints through a thinning stretch of trees, heart pounding in rhythm with her footsteps. The forest was quiet except for the occasional call of a mourning dove. The silence pressed in tight. Then came a sound, a twig snapping. She froze. Not far ahead, the soft shuffle of movement in the brush. Nolan raised her hand. The team paused. She motioned forward, slow and steady, each step measured. The figure emerged through a break in the trees. It was the girl, Lena. She looked older than in the photos, but still so small. Thin, her hoodie hung loosely around her shoulders, her hair tangled, eyes wide with fear. She stood frozen in the clearing, clutching a cloth bag to her chest. Nolan didn't move. "Lena," she said softly. "It's okay. You're safe now." But Lena didn't speak. Her eyes darted to the side. From the trees behind her, a man appeared, unshaven, sunburned, eyes hollow. Ray Doyle. He stepped forward slowly, one arm reaching toward Lena, the other slipping behind his back. "Don't," Nolan warned, drawing her weapon. "Hands where I can see them." Doyle paused, eyes locked on hers. He didn't run, didn't speak. He simply stared, something unreadable flickering across his face. Then, slowly, he raised both hands. Lena took a step back from him, and then another. Sutherland emerged behind Nolan, weapon drawn, voice firm. "Get on the ground. Now." Doyle dropped to his knees without a word. Lena ran, right into Nolan's arms. Thin, shaking, silent. "I've got you," Nolan whispered, holding her tight. "You're safe now. He won't touch you again." The ride back to town was quiet. Lena sat beside Detective Nolan in the back seat of an unmarked SUV, wrapped in a blanket too big for her small frame. She didn't speak, didn't cry. Her eyes stayed on the trees as they passed, watching them blur into one endless stream of green. Nolan glanced over now and then, resisting the urge to fill the silence with words that wouldn't help. Sometimes presence spoke louder than anything else. At the hospital, a team was already waiting. The moment they arrived, Lena was guided gently into the care of pediatric nurses and trauma specialists. Nolan stayed close, signing paperwork, answering questions, but keeping her eyes on the girl whose name had anchored an entire town in grief for almost a decade. Inside a small exam room, Lena sat on the edge of the bed, silent under the fluorescent lights. She flinched slightly when a nurse reached for her wrist to attach a monitor, but didn't resist. Her fingers remained curled tightly around the drawstring of the cloth bag she still carried. She hadn't let it go, not once, not even when Doyle had been handcuffed and loaded into a cruiser. The doctor entered gently, moving slow, speaking softer than necessary. "We're going to run some tests," she said, kneeling in front of her. "Just to make sure you're okay." Lena didn't respond. She just nodded, barely. From the hallway, Nolan watched through the glass, her jaw tight. The nurse beside her whispered, "There's bruising, Thin wrists, old scars, signs of restraint. But she's stable, malnourished but stable. Nolan exhaled slowly. Stable. That was something. She stepped into the room and crouched beside the bed, careful not to startle her. "Lena," she said softly. "I spoke to your mom. She's on her way. She's coming to see you." Lena's eyes moved slowly toward her. For a moment, nothing. Then a blink, a breath. "My mom?" she whispered, her voice brittle and small. "Yes," Nolan said, nodding. She never stopped looking. Lena didn't speak again, but her hand finally opened. She reached out, and Nolan took it gently, and for the first time in 9 years, someone held her without fear. Joanna didn't remember the drive. She didn't remember the officer escorting her through the hospital lobby or the sound of her own footsteps echoing in the hallway. Her mind was a blur, her heart pounding in a rhythm that drowned out every other noise. The only thing she could feel was the pull in her chest, like an invisible thread leading her to the room where her daughter waited. When she reached the door, she paused. Her hand hovered just above the handle. What if Lena didn't remember her? What if too much time had passed? What if she was too changed? Then the door opened from the inside. Detective Nolan stood there, her eyes soft. She didn't speak. She just stepped aside. Joanna entered the room slowly. Lena sat up on the hospital bed, her legs tucked beneath the oversized blanket. She looked so small, so still. Her hair was shorter than Joanna remembered, uneven, like someone had cut it with dull scissors. Her face was thinner, cheeks hollow, but her eyes, those were the same. Lena looked up. For a moment, the room held its breath. Joanna crossed the space between them and dropped to her knees beside the bed. "Hi," she whispered, voice trembling. Lena didn't speak right away. Her lower lip quivered, and her hand clutched the corner of the blanket. Joanna reached out, stopping just short of touching her. "It's me," she said. "It's Mom." Lena blinked, and a tear slipped down her cheek. Then, quietly, she whispered, "I thought you were gone." Joanna shook her head, the tears now spilling freely. "Never. I never stopped looking for you." Lena leaned forward, hesitant at first, then suddenly collapsing into her mother's arms, burying her face into the crook of her neck. Joanna wrapped both arms around her, holding her like she was something sacred, something broken and still whole. "I missed you every day," Lena whispered through sobs. Joanna pressed her lips to her daughter's temple. "I missed you every second." Outside the door, Nolan stepped back and closed it gently behind her, leaving them in that moment. After 9 years, mother and daughter were together again, and this time no one would take her away. The news spread fast. By the following morning, Lena Calhoun's name was on every local headline, every news ticker, every whisper passed from one neighbor to the next. After nearly a decade lost, she had been found, alive. Her photograph, the most recent one taken from her hospital bed, was carefully cropped and blurred, but it didn't matter. People recognized her, the missing girl with the soft eyes and the pink shoelaces, the child from the lake. But what none of the news anchors could capture was the quiet that followed, the strange stillness that settled over those closest to her, like the calm after a long, violent storm. Detective Nolan sat alone in her office, the weight of the investigation finally lifting from her shoulders, but she didn't feel relief. Not yet. They still hadn't found Ben Calhoun. Lena had spoken briefly, haltingly. Her voice was hoarse from disuse, her memories tangled, but one thing was clear. Her uncle had fought. She remembered him yelling. She remembered him being dragged away, struggling. She remembered the sound of the lake behind her as she was taken in the opposite direction. For years, everyone had believed Ben had drowned, that he had slipped or perhaps tried to save Lena and gone under himself. But now there was no such certainty. There was only the sickening realization that he might have died protecting her. A team had already returned to the cove, this time with ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. The same waters that had once held nothing but question marks were now being scoured with fresh urgency. Nolan stared at the map pinned to her wall, her eyes locked on the coordinates where Doyle had camped. He had moved frequently, but always with intention. Every place was secluded, every trace carefully covered. Until now. In the hospital, Joanna sat beside Lena's bed, brushing through the tangles in her hair with slow, gentle strokes. Lena didn't speak much, but she leaned into her mother's touch. Each moment was fragile, stitched together by memory and time lost. When Joanna asked softly about Ben, Lena simply said, "He didn't let go." Joanna closed her eyes. Neither would she. The divers moved slowly through the shallows of Lake Wren, their dark wetsuits cutting through the green water like shadows. The surface was still, disturbed only by the occasional ripple of a frog leaping or a bird diving low overhead. A small crowd had gathered along the tree line, silent and tense. No cameras, no reporters. Just law enforcement, park rangers, and the forensic team working with the quiet focus of people who knew they were about to unearth something sacred. Detective Nolan stood near the edge, arms crossed tightly against her chest. She had reviewed the topography maps, marked the depth charts, traced every point where Lena might have last seen her uncle. But it wasn't until one of the dogs had alerted near a sunken shelf that she knew this was it. The cove where the GoPro footage had captured the doll floating all those weeks ago. The same cove where a backpack had been found half buried in the silt. One of the divers surfaced and gave a signal. The team scrambled into motion. A few moments later, a long, heavy object was pulled gently from the water, wrapped in a waterlogged tarp. No one spoke. Nolan stepped closer, the wind brushing her face, soft and cool despite the sun overhead. They had found him. Later that day, it was confirmed through dental records and personal effects. The remains belonged to Benjamin Calhoun. He had been buried beneath the water in a weighted bundle, hidden where no one had thought to search deeply. Until now. Joanna received the call in Lena's hospital room. She didn't cry. She simply bowed her head, one hand resting on her daughter's, the other clutched tightly around the photo of Ben she had never stopped carrying. "He saved her," she whispered, almost to herself. "He never let her go." Lena said nothing, but a single tear slid down her cheek. She reached into her cloth bag and pulled something out. A small, faded stone, painted years ago in bright blue with crooked letters that read, "Best Uncle Ever." She held it in both hands, staring down at it like a piece of the world had finally come home. Ben hadn't vanished. He had protected her until the very end. The funeral was small. A quiet service held under a gray sky at a hilltop cemetery just outside town. Only close family and a few members of the original search party were present. No cameras, no press. Just silence and wind and the low murmur of grief as Benjamin Calhoun was laid to rest. Joanna stood beside the casket with Lena at her side, their hands clasped tightly. Lena wore a simple blue dress, her hair brushed back, a soft white cardigan draped around her shoulders. She had asked to come, insisted really. When someone offered to stay with her at the hospital, she had shaken her head and whispered, "He waited for me." So now she was here. Detective Nolan stood a few rows back, her arms folded gently in front of her. She watched as Joanna stepped forward and placed a single sunflower on the casket, followed by Lena, who reached into her cloth bag and drew out the painted stone. She laid it on top, pressing it down with trembling fingers. No words were spoken by the family, none were needed. After the service, as people drifted away, Nolan approached quietly. She offered Joanna a nod and turned to Lena, crouching slightly to meet her eyes. "I wanted to thank you," she said softly, "for holding on, for helping us find him." Lena looked down at the grass, then up again, voice small but steady. "He said not to be afraid. He said if I could just stay quiet, someone would come." Nolan's throat tightened. "And you did. You were brave." Joanna rested a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "We're taking some time away, just a few weeks, somewhere quiet." Nolan nodded. "You both deserve that." As they walked back to the car, Lena glanced over her shoulder one last time at the grave, her face unreadable. There was sadness there, but something else too, something deeper, a kind of peace. Ben's story had always been a mystery in the public eye, but for those who loved him, it was never about the unknown. It was about the kind of man who gave everything to protect a child. Now he was home, and the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of love. The cabin was small, tucked away at the edge of a quiet lake in northern Vermont. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms and a screened porch, but it was peaceful. The kind of place where the silence didn't feel heavy anymore, where the wind whispered through the trees instead of howling. Lena sat on the porch swing, wrapped in a quilt, her bare feet dangling just above the wooden planks. A mug of cocoa sat beside her, still steaming in the cool morning air. It had been 3 months since the rescue. 3 months of slow steps, long talks, and sleepless nights. The therapist said healing wouldn't come all at once. It would take time, patience, safety. Lena didn't speak much, but she listened. And sometimes, late at night, she asked small questions about her old bedroom, about school, about the friend with the sunflower backpack, about whether her bike was still in the garage. Joanna sat nearby, a journal open in her lap, her pen moving slowly across the page. Every now and then, she glanced up at her daughter, just watching, just breathing her in. There were still shadows under Lena's eyes, but the haunted look had faded. In its place was something fragile but real, a girl learning to live again. News outlets had moved on. The trial for Ray Doyle was set to begin in the fall, and the prosecution had more than enough evidence to keep him locked away for the rest of his life. Joanna wouldn't attend the proceedings. She didn't need to. She already had everything she came for. Lena shifted in the swing and reached into her cloth bag. From it, she pulled a worn drawing, a picture she had made long ago. A man and a girl standing near the lake, holding hands. She had drawn it in silence, hidden it in the thermos, and thrown it into the water, hoping someone, anyone, would see it. Now she stared at it, the corners soft from years in the dark, and smiled for the first time in a very long while. Some stories don't end with answers. They end with beginnings. And on the edge of that quiet lake, one had just begun.